Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you so much for listening. This week, we're going to break protocol a little bit. It's not just Clay and I introducing the podcast, but our special guest this week, Lindsay Chervinsky. Would you tell our listeners again how they can find your blogs, etc.?
Absolutely. The best place is my website, which is lindsaychervinsky.com. It's easy to find because there's only one of me, so even if you butcher my name, it's fine. And you can sign up for my newsletter, which is called Imperfect Union there, and that will give you links to all of my latest op-eds and podcasts and articles and essays, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Very good. And I have to say again, how much we appreciate your time. That's all any of us have, really. And you're sharing it so generously to be on the Jefferson Hour. And as we talked about in the show, we get tremendous emails from our listeners and how much they appreciate it. I have people in the staff here that listen to the show who come to me and say, when's Lindsay going to be on again? She's great. So I'm not making this up. So thank you so much for being so generous with your time. And Clay, there was a couple of things we didn't get to on the show. Do you want to?
I don't. We obviously can't do justice to Thomas Paine in an hour. But if you think about his importance, we have a hard time measuring his influence. We have a hard time measuring just how impactful he was. But sort of exiled from Britain for his radicalism, comes to America, immediately becomes a huge force in the American Revolution, just completely on board from the beginning. And writes this incredible, I'm going to call it social media pamphlet, which has something like a galvanizing effect, and everyone is praising it. People are envious of it. Of course, John Adams is envious of it because John Adams is always envious of other people's achievement. And then he goes on and writes the crisis papers, which may be more important than Common Sense because he's writing when we're actually on the ropes. And he's trying to stir up American patriotism and support for this war that is going very, very badly at that moment. Those papers are not as well known and they're not as sparkling in their prose. They were written hot off the press during a time of a really extraordinary crisis. And then he goes off to Europe because that's the next big thing. And the next big thing is the French Revolution. And I think he, like Jefferson and others, thought, what happened in America is going to just cross the Atlantic, and the fire that we lit, as Jefferson would put it, is going to burn out all these tyrannies in the old world. And he wanted to be there. He wanted to be at the center of action and did good things. But the French Revolution went so sour so fast that he couldn't keep up with it and barely survives. And meanwhile, he's writing against Edmund Burke. That takes some hubris. And he's writing The Age of Reason, which is about rational Christianity at a time when this is really like writing a pro-communist book in the 1950s. He's an odd person. He's a radical, but he wants to be at the center of things. He doesn't listen to the art of the possible. I mean, Jefferson is always gauging what's possible beyond the walls of Monticello, but Paine's just like, this is the way this should be. This is how I think it should be. And not everyone could accept that. And when he touched George Washington by way of deep criticism and touched public criticism and received Christianity, there were people that just said, I want nothing more to do with this guy. Too bad, because it's interesting to try to speculate of what his life might have been had he maintained his market share as a kind of international hero.
And with that, sir, may we go on to this week's show?
We can just want to say that the summer Lewis and Clark trips are coming, the winter encampments are coming. There's Monterey, there's John Steinbeck's California, Monterey, Salinas, and even Tehachapi Pass. All of those they can find out about the Jefferson at jeffersonhour.com, plus my online course on the Aeneid, which is coming up very fast. And then in the fall, in November, the fourth version of my online course on the U.S. Constitution. And so much is going on. And Lindsay's book, The Cabinet, you can get at all of your favorite sources and order it from Amazon or Barnes & Noble if that's preferential. And the paperback is coming. And my book, The Language of Cottonwoods, Essays on the Future of North Dakota, I think it's now up to 8 readers. And so I couldn't be happier about that. So David, thank you. Semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Thanks to you, Lindsay. We're always really delighted to have you here, and we'll see you all soon. Let's listen to the program.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson, when he's here, is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author and creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and we are so pleased to once again be joined by one of our favorite contributors, Lindsay Chervinsky. Lindsay is a senior fellow at the Center for Presidential History, a fellow at the International Center for Jefferson Studies, a professional lecturer, School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. And perhaps most importantly for this week, she is a scholar in residence at the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies. And Lindsay, the last time you were on, the three of us agreed it would be appropriate to have a discussion about Thomas Paine, and I am so looking forward to this, to listening to the two of you and learning more about this figure. So welcome to the show and welcome back. We're so happy to have you.
Well, thank you for having me back. I'm excited to talk about it, and I'm also excited to learn more because despite, spending a lot of years in this time period, Thomas Paine has never actually been my sole focus. So there's always more to learn. And as I was saying before we started, he's kind of the Forrest Gump of the Revolution, early Republic period. And so the more you dig in, the more there is to discover because he's just everywhere and constantly doing stuff. So I'm excited to chat about it.
Perhaps before we start, you could give us sort of an overview of who he was and why he was so important to that period of history of the American Revolution.
Well, let me start with some sort of data. He was born in Great Britain, so he was a British citizen. He had sort of rudimentary education. He was not college educated or what we would consider to be a scholar. At one point, he decides to make his way to the United States, which, of course, at the time was not the United States. It was the American colonies. And he befriended Benjamin Franklin pretty early on. And then through a series of fortuitous engagements, comes into contact with all of the great figures that we would think of the time. He was in the Army with George Washington. He corresponded regularly with Benjamin Rush, who sort of pushed him to write Common Sense. He went on to serve in Congress, not as a actual congressman, but as an important figure. He then after the war, went back to Great Britain and wrote a bunch of stuff that really made people angry. So he fled Great Britain to avoid arrest, went to France, defended the French Revolution, was then thrown in prison during the Reign of Terror, barely squeaked by with his life, which is a fantastic story that we should talk about, and then eventually makes his way back to the United States, and he's basically a pariah. And when he dies, 6 people go to his funeral. So sort of a sad end to a long and what probably could have been glorious career.
Thomas Paine is a sort of an interesting central and also marginal figure in this whole story. He seems to be everywhere. He annoyed a lot of people. He nearly got himself killed in the French Revolution, even though he was a friend to the rights of man, as he put it. He was a good friend of Thomas Jefferson, but a troublesome friend of Jefferson because he was toxic by the time he got back from France, and Jefferson befriended him. Jefferson was loyal to the people who had helped promote the American Revolution, and he believed in Paine, even though he didn't always approve of Paine's stridencies or sometimes radical thoughts or lack of decorum. If Paine had not existed, how would things have been different?
That's a big counterfactual. I don't know that there are any major outcomes that necessarily would have ultimately changed, but the support for them, the way that they unfold, the ideas behind his writings. He was the person that could take the scholarly concepts that people like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and then, English philosophers wrote about and put them into terms that allowed the American people to grasp them and to understand why it was important. So he sped up processes that I think maybe would have happened anyway, but he made them happen when they did.
He wrote Common Sense. Benjamin Rush suggested the title. It was written in plain English. He was able to take the kind of abstractions that Jefferson loved to live in and apply them in a kind of a demotic language of the streets that people could readily understand. It's America's first great bestseller. The usual view of it, Lindsay, is that he was able to sell the revolution to the American people, that the document was extremely important. It wasn't just a bestseller, but that it helped people get on board because the colorfulness and the directness of his language serves as a kind of reductio ad absurdum. Jefferson can talk about monarchy and the rights of the sovereign and the responsibilities of citizens, and then just Paine cuts through it with these very stark, direct sentences that call, for example, George III the royal brute of England. And that's the kind of language that a person who's just on the street of New York, Boston, or Philadelphia can readily understand. They don't have to have been educated in the Enlightenment to get it.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, and I think it's really important for people to understand when we read about the American Revolution in our textbooks and our books, we often talk about the political principles that American colonists were talking about and the political powers of different people and what the political relationship should be. But the average American didn't care about that, really. They didn't care what was the constitutional relationship. They didn't know. And so what Paine was so good at doing was to take those sort of pie-in-the-sky ideas and apply them to everyday life in a way that people understood why these were bread and butter issues. And he had a flair for sort of the average dramatic, the language that would be very evocative and colorful but accessible, and he understood how people consumed this medium. So not only was it very powerful when it was read, but as we've talked about in our previous conversation about technology, so many of these pamphlets and articles were read out loud, and they were shared at taverns and on street corners. And so he had a knack for writing for oratory as well, an oratory that would inspire the average American. And that was a skill that I'm not sure. I mean, I think you maybe can learn it, but he clearly just had a deep understanding of it deep in his soul somewhere because he didn't have that education and just somehow knew how to speak to people in that way.
I'm so glad that the two of you decided to begin with common sense. From my little knowledge of Paine, it would seem that is the indelible mark that he left on the revolution. And I so agree with your assessment, Lindsay, that I don't want to say he wrote down to people because he didn't write down to them, but he wrote in a style that the average American could say, yeah, that's right. A couple of years ago, I did a books on tape reading of Common Sense, which was great fun. And he begins in the beginning with an introduction that starts, perhaps the sentiments contained in the following pages are not yet sufficiently fashionable to procure them general favor. A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right. And that is so contemporary.
Actually, one of the themes that I was sort of flagging as I was going through my Paine notes is how unbelievably modern so many of his ideas are and really ahead of his time, which I think is part of the reason he had so many enemies, because he had ideas that were quite radical for the 18th century. And he was very vocally anti-slavery. He supported taxing rich landowners to help people have pensions. He believed in education and suffrage and voting, and he was a deist and outspokenly so. So he criticized organized religion before it was trendy to do so. But I do think that helps explain sort of why he constantly was putting his foot in his mouth. But I did want to circle back to what you were saying, David, about it being a bestseller and just kind of give a sense to people of the numbers because they are truly remarkable. So in the first 3 months that it was published, it's estimated that 120,000 copies were sold. And by the end of the Revolution, 500,000 copies were sold. Now, keep in mind, at the time, the population, which was excluding the white population of the colonies, was about 2.5 million people. And those were the copies that were purchased. Those are not just the people that heard it or, shared it with their neighbors and friends and family. So when we are talking a bestseller, we are talking like a runaway, extraordinary, the only thing that beat it was the Bible.
So 500,000, if the population is even 3 million, that's 1 out of 6. I mean, that's a huge bestseller. I won't ask you how many copies the cabinet sold or how many copies my books sell, but it's pitiful.
Not that many. But if anyone would like to buy that many, they're welcome to do so.
Of course. And Christmas is coming, of course. But, 500,000 copies of this, essentially pamphlet. I think it was read to troops. It was read out in churches. It was read in public squares and coffee houses and taverns. It's the kind of thing that appeals to people who are annoyed by the faraway British government and the king. There are insults in it. He's terrific at insults in a way that Jefferson would not descend to do, but everyone was feeling out there. If you think about abstraction, so Jefferson is a pretty great prose stylist, accessible to almost everybody. Hamilton is a great prose stylist when he wants to be. George Washington is not a great prose stylist, but he's an adequate prose stylist. Adams is not a great prose stylist. When I have to read some of the things that I've written for audio dissemination, I wonder if this is true for you, Lindsay. I realize, my writing style does not necessarily lend itself automatically to an audio presentation, because I have parentheses and subordinate clauses and so on. You just have to noun, verb, noun. You have to give very direct sentences to be understandable in a podcast. And Adams certainly didn't have that quality. Madison didn't have that quality, but Paine did, and that's part of what made him so amazing. That someone reading a paragraph from Common Sense would be immediately understood throughout a coffee house. That wouldn't necessarily be the case of something from the Federalist Papers.
Correct.
We do need to take a short break, but I'm going to give each of you 10 seconds to expound on that millions of sales. We just got quick titles, and I know both of you have new books.
So my book is The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. The hardcover came out in April 2020, and the paperback will be out February 2022.
My most latest book is called The Language of Cottonwoods, Essays on the Future of North Dakota, just out, and I think there are 7 purchasers so far, so I'm really happy.
Both of these books are easy to find, and I would encourage all of you to check them both out. They're great reads, both of them. And with that, we are going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, our returning friend, much sought after by our listeners. Lindsay Chervinsky is with us. She has many titles, and one of them involves Thomas Paine. So just before we went to break, I was just suggesting that Paine's style was such that it could be immediately spoken out in a church, in the public square, in a coffee house or a tavern, and the lack of complexity was a great strength. So in a sense, he was anticipating the kind of directness of social media in our own time.
He really was, and it was quite intentional because his writing was accurate and it was thoughtful and it was compelling, but it was very intentionally propaganda. Everything from his early pamphlets, The American Crisis, which started before the Common Sense publication, and those going later, he was never writing to be known as a political philosopher like Adams was. He was never writing to make the intense sort of political arguments like the Federalist Papers. He was writing to speak to the average American and explain why they should care about something. And I would actually encourage the listeners to go read some of those things you talked about. Look at the Federalist Papers, look at John Adams' defenses, and then look at Common Sense. And we've all spent a great deal of time in 18th century documents, and I can attest which ones are easier for me to dig into, and I assure you 18th century readers felt the same.
He goes to France. He becomes a champion of the French people. He becomes a citizen of France. And then he gets crosswise with the Reign of Terror, is thrust into prison, nearly dies.
What's really important to know about his arrival in France is the reason he had to leave Great Britain was because he published a pamphlet called The Rights of Man, which was defending the French Revolution against Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France. So he literally was positioning himself as the defender of the French Revolution. He was voted into the convention, even though he at that point was not a French citizen and didn't speak French. He had voted in favor of this new constitution. Interestingly, he voted against the execution of the king because he did not believe in corporal punishment, another very modern idea. When the more radical elements during the French Revolution took power, in particular Robespierre, he was the sort of the leader of that element, came to power. He considered Paine to be a real enemy. I don't think there's any particular reason why. Maybe it was just a personal dislike. So in December of 1793, Paine was arrested and thrown in prison. And during the Reign of Terror, basically every night the jailers would go and they would mark with white chalk on the outside of the doors who was destined to be executed the following morning. Needless to say, these were without trials or any sort of real process and deliberation. On the night before Paine was set to be executed, the jailer made the X mark, but Paine's door had been open because he had visitors that day, and the jailer made the mark on the inside of the door. So when the door was closed, no one could see it. And the next morning, the troops came around to take the people that were to be executed to the guillotine, and they did not see this check mark. So Paine survived another day. He survived a few more days, and then Robespierre ultimately met his downfall in 1794, and that was really sort of when the Reign of Terror started to taper off and the executions diminished. But it wasn't until Monroe, who was the American minister to France, really advocated on behalf of Paine, saying, no, he is an American citizen. You are not allowed to imprison an American citizen, that Paine was actually released.
It's a great story. I mean, he came so close, and it's just almost a trick of historical fate that he was able to live through that night. The chalk on the door, we can see that scene. He was in bad health, languishing in prison, probably in rags, certain that he was going to die. And then there's not a reprieve. It's a reprieve by a nick of fate. He made two gigantic mistakes in the course of his life, at least. First, he attacked George Washington. He said that Washington had not done enough for him during his time in prison, that as an American citizen and as somebody who had played a significant role in American liberty and independence, he deserved better at the hands of the Washington administration. And his letter was a public letter, and it was a personal letter, and it was, in many respects, an aggressive and mean-spirited letter. And one thing you know better than anybody is that you do not attack George Washington successfully.
No, you don't. Paine had seen up close and personal the darkest moments of Washington's service during the war. And at the time, he had really excused them, or he had said that it wasn't Washington's fault that these things had happened and instead was inadequacies of supplies or troops or what have you. Washington, when Paine was imprisoned, Washington did not want to interfere because this was the height of the neutrality crisis. When France and Great Britain were at war, the United States was trying to stay out of it. The United States was trying to get citizen Edmond Charles Genet, who was the French minister, to abide by neutrality, which he was not doing. And Washington worried that if he interfered in this matter, it would really cause the French to take up war against them as well. Keep in mind also, the French administration was incredibly unstable, was changing day to day. It was not clear who was actually in charge. If they made an agreement with one faction, would that other faction, go back on it? So there was a lot of reasons why Washington didn't interfere. Paine resented that deeply, resented that his service didn't count for more and that there wasn't more advocacy on his behalf. And he sent Washington a private letter basically accusing him of not giving support, accusing him of being a hypocrite for not supporting the French and the French Revolution, and Washington didn't reply. I mean, obviously, you don't feed the trolls. This is something that we know in the 21st century. Washington did not reply. When Washington didn't send a letter back, Paine then reached out to Benjamin Franklin Bache, who was the editor of a very critical newspaper and had been a thorn in Washington's side for quite some time, and published an open letter to Washington for the entire world to see. Now, Washington was willing to forgive criticism as long as it was private. If you published a letter, either his correspondence or critical of him, that was it. And a lot of people felt the same way. Even James Monroe, who had, gone out of his way to try and help Paine and had welcomed him into his home, basically said it's time for you to leave once he published that letter, because it accused him of being duplicitous and hypocritical and a terrible general and all sorts of really quite, awful things. I saved a line in the letter because it's so brutal. He said, "The world will be puzzled to decide whether you are an apostate or an impostor, whether you have abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any."
I don't want to defend that letter, but I do want to defend Paine. Yes, it was a thorny business, and the administrations in Paris were changing overnight, and it wasn't even clear to whom you write. And this was a time when we didn't want us to ratchet anything up. We wanted to ratchet things down in this very difficult neutrality moment in American life. But Paine deserved better. I mean, if one of our citizens, a mere citizen, is unfairly jailed in a foreign country that's going through despotic spasms, it's in the interest of the United States to defend that person, no matter how hard that is. And Paine was not just any citizen. He was a very important American or Anglo-American patriot. And so I think that they made a mistake in not doing more for Paine. And I can understand if you got a chalk mark away from death and your home country and the president had done nothing for you, I can understand why you might allow a little bitterness to come out of your pen. But of course, that letter was such that many people who might have sided with Paine had to break with him over this because of the sheer lack of decorum and respect that he showed President Washington. Jefferson did not break with him. The second great mistake that Paine made was producing The Age of Reason. And even though Jefferson agreed with much of the argumentation in The Age of Reason, basically attacking revelatory Christianity and saying that we needed to bring a rational lens to the life of Jesus and his teachings, and that much of Christianity was infantile and superstitious, and irrational people must now begin to discard it. The fact that he would publish a book that bold hurt him maybe as much as the letter about George Washington. And I remember that when he came back, Samuel Adams, who had been an old friend of his, said, I can never want to know you anymore after this. This is a nasty, anti-Christian, atheistical book. It was none of those things. But the sharpness of Paine's pen that works so well in Common Sense turns out to be a liability when you start to talk about received Christianity.
Yes. I want to circle back to one thing you said about defending Paine, and I think that there are two important sort of notes to include. He also blamed Gouverneur Morris, who was the American minister to France before James Monroe. And I think he actually deserves more of the blame, because Washington was obviously not going to go to France, and he was not going to write letters to France. That's the role of an American minister. And Morris didn't particularly like Paine, and so didn't particularly feel like helping him. So I think he actually deserves a lot more of the censure. The second thing that I want to say in terms of the letter about Washington, it's the way I think of it is we can all criticize our own mothers, but when other people criticize them, we are not okay with that. And I think that a lot of Americans sort of saw that letter and, pulled up the drawbridge, so to speak, against Paine, because it was perfectly okay for them to think it, but it wasn't okay for someone to publish it internationally.
First of all, you say drawbridge. That raises the question of Paine's suspension bridge, his iron bridge, which we can talk about perhaps. But this seeming attack on Christianity was a very fatal blow to Paine, and probably it finished off whatever reputation he had in this country. Absolutely.
It's very important to keep in mind that 18th century and early 19th century America was a deeply religious society. And not just spiritual, like we might think of today, but your church was often the institution that you were closest to. It was where you were baptized. It was where you were married. It was where your children were baptized. You went to church almost every week, if not every week, if not multiple times per week. And Americans often they didn't travel far from where they were born. They didn't settle far from where they were born. So their church was the institution that they most closely associated with. The federal government was quite small. They didn't have a whole lot of interaction with that. And local church leaders were often the people that helped sort of enforce social customs and norms and laws. And so to attack the church was equivalent to sort of attacking the most treasured part of society. And deism as a thing, and you're right to say that Thomas Paine was not promoting atheism here. He was not saying that there shouldn't be a religion or there isn't a God. He was saying that organized religion is sort of a scam. My words, but I'm summing up here. And that was deeply insulting to a lot of people. I mean, even think of Sam Adams, like you said. He was a very radical person, but he was involved in his church. He was from New England, and New Englanders, my goodness, did they hold on to their church. They were very intense Congregationalists. John Adams was no exception. And so it was really blasphemy and not something that was easy to overlook, which is why Thomas Jefferson, although he shared those ideas and, obviously came up with his own Bible, didn't want that stuff to come out until after he died.
And maybe not then. Jefferson was incredibly smart about these things, and so many times, I'm sure you've read much of Jefferson's correspondence. No matter what he's writing about, he'll say to you, Lindsay, or to James Madison, I would not want anyone to read this. This is between us. Please be really careful. He was paranoid, I think is the right word, about his own views leaking out, and he's constantly admonishing the recipients of his letters to keep them to themselves. Paine did not have any of that restraining mechanism in him.
Well, and Jefferson was correct to fear that, because even though he didn't publish these ideas, his sort of obvious ambivalence towards church attendance caused Federalists in the 1796 and 1800 elections in particular to suggest that he was an atheist and he was going to come for your Bible if he won. So you had to bury it in your backyard because he was going to steal them if he won. And that was a huge campaign talking point. It's actually still a campaign talking point, but in 1800 it was as well. And so, Jefferson was right to be wary of that.
If I recall, Lindsay, I don't think the Federalist said that he was running a sex ring in a pizza parlor in Washington. I don't think so.
No.
He also got Jefferson in trouble at least twice. He comes back, finally. Jefferson offers to send a packet boat, an American ship, to bring him back. Jefferson is now president after the ordeal of the Reign of Terror. Paine does not take up that offer from Jefferson, but he does make his way back to the United States. And then Jefferson has Paine come live with him in the White House for about a month. Almost nothing that Jefferson did as president caused so much outrage as housing the atheist, the filthy atheist, Paine was neither, in the White House. And that's one of the issues. The other issue is that Jefferson wrote a little covering letter to one of Paine's books before it went to a publisher. It's leaked to the press. Jefferson never intended that covering letter to be published. The whole Federalist world came down like a hammer on Jefferson for it. So a couple of times, Paine managed to make Jefferson's life difficult.
He did. And in those ways, I'm not sure he even necessarily was intending to, but it's one of those cases of, especially when you're president, you have to be really mindful of who your friends are and who you choose to associate with. And this is true today. I mean, I think about the scandal when people pulled up, old speeches of one of Obama's pastors. And because he had attended a church, not even necessarily those sermons, but he had attended the church, therefore he was, targeted with or tarnished by this, by these sermons. I mean, that's just part of sort of politics today. And I credit Jefferson for his loyalty to Paine, but it really wasn't very smart political thinking.
But I like Jefferson better for this, don't you? That
oh, yeah.
He's a politician, of course, but he also is a deeply generous and thoughtful human being who realizes that Paine is a hero and that he's down on his luck, and that by gesturing to house him, he's providing some support to a person who's under siege. That's the very reverse of the kind of political expediency that we see as a routine matter in our time, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that Jefferson also identified and sympathized with some of Paine's more radical ideas and didn't feel that he could speak to them, but felt that Paine could. I mean, certainly he was much more supportive of the French Revolution than many Americans and continued to be long after it was clear that it was a very bloody, violent experience. He continued to believe that, revolution was sometimes necessary and radical reform was important. They clearly shared ideas about religion. Would love to have been a fly on the wall about those conversations. Paine and Jefferson both, you alluded to this earlier, but they both had a real interest in engineering and science and an ability to be creative about coming up with new solutions to engineering problems. And I imagine, I don't know, but I imagine that Paine probably pushed Jefferson on slavery too. So I suspect that there were a lot of issues that they really saw eye to eye on, and Jefferson wished that he could have been more open about, and for whatever reason, politically or not, he didn't think that he could.
I hesitate to disagree with you, I will, on this tiny little point, Lindsay. I don't think anyone dared to talk to Jefferson about slavery. There was kind of a tacit wall that if you're going to be Jefferson's friend, you have to leave that question alone. And that the price of raising the question with Jefferson is that he quietly withdraws from your life. That's one of the most troubling aspects of Jefferson, that is all of his friends essentially are Enlightenment emancipationists and abolitionists. And they all learned early on that you have to tiptoe around Jefferson on the question of race. And I think that it would have been better if they had just let him have it.
We will take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
We hesitate even to take a break. This conversation is so interesting, and we're doing it on Zoom, and Lindsay's raising her hand, and I'm raising my hand, and David is just trying to juggle all of this. It's so much fun. I hope you'll come back again and again. We love your fresh insights, and you have a huge and growing fan base. And Joe Ellis is said to be now cowering and shaking in his boots because he feels he may be displaced as the returning champion. At any rate, so I think you have something you wanted to say per the conversation we've just been in.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, you've spent more time looking at this correspondence than I have, and you were saying that, all of Jefferson's friends sort of tiptoed, and I was curious how you saw both William Short and Lafayette fitting into that calculation, because they both had much more anti-slavery ideas, and I don't know if you would characterize it as an on-again, off-again friendship, or how you see them fitting into that formula.
Yeah, so it would be fun to go through this. In fact, I could do a wonderful monograph about Jefferson's Enlightenment friends and Jefferson and slavery. And William Short was one of his favorite proteges, at times his favorite protege, the most talented of them in some respects. And Short was with him in France. Short offended Jefferson in a couple of ways, unfortunately. He fell in love with a married woman, and Jefferson was a little squeamish about that, particularly diplomatically, because the aristocrat in question was Jefferson's friend. And Short wrote a letter to Jefferson saying that he was an Epicurean, but he outlined Epicureanism as sort of pursuit of pleasure. And Jefferson wrote a very sharp letter back to Short saying, Epicureanism is not pursuit of pleasure, that's hedonism. Epicureanism is rational pursuit of pleasure. It was something of a rebuke. And then maybe the sharpest letter that Jefferson ever wrote was to William Short about the French Revolution, when Short was whining about the terror. And that's when Jefferson said, if there were one Adam and one Eve alive in every nation and alive free, arguably the most extreme sentence that ever came out of Jefferson's pen. So Short probably didn't have enough cred, and he was a Virginian, and they all understood each other. There was a whole kind of, we all understand this situation, it's tragic, but what can we do? As to Lafayette, I think Jefferson would have dismissed him as a kind of an idealistic do-gooder who wasn't sufficiently grounded in the real world. I think Jefferson always felt condescending towards Lafayette, which is a mistake. I think the person who finally did it, Lindsay, was Adams. And late in the correspondence, the late years correspondence, during the Missouri Compromise, Adams wrote one of his best letters to Jefferson and said, I've never dared to bring this up with you because I trust you Virginians, Washington, Madison, Monroe. I know you're honorable men. I'm a New Englander. I've never brought it up, but I have to bring it up now because in my sleep I see, as it were, armies of black and white marching in the sky. And he was having a kind of an apocalyptic nightmare about the future of the American Republic. And then he says, we have to think about this. And then he says, but who am I? And so even John Adams, the most pugnacious of all of Jefferson's friends, gets to the lip of slavery, and he kind of tiptoes back because I think he knows he could only hurt Jefferson's feelings. That's what's so horrible about this. It's like Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, whose feelings are hurt because he's been harassing his aides, Jefferson's feelings would be hurt. That's how slavery works. You tell Jefferson this is fundamentally unjust, and he's going to do one of two things. He's either going to get his feelings hurt, how dare you not understand my nobility and integrity, or he's going to do one of his Jefferson letters. Nobody feels more certainly than I do than this people must and will be free. Jefferson has a dodge every time this comes up, and I think people just understood it, that it was a whopper that nobody could make sense of, and that Jefferson was not going to ever have a robust dialogue about this. So there's a long answer to a short question, but what's your view of it?
I think that's probably right, and I share your lament that I wish that they had sometimes let him have it, because I think because of who he was, he sort of got away with those dodges in ways that other people would not have.
It's something I both love and hate about Jefferson. He's exquisite. He's this tall, somewhat fragile Virginia gentleman who's above the cut and thrust of politics. You always have to treat him as if he's exquisite. He carved out that position for himself. And maybe that's just who he was, that he was fragile in this way. But it worked. It was incredibly successful. The Federalists went after him, but he just shrugged that off, of course. So we're straying from our man Paine. The personal rap on Paine, aside from his capacity for saying something too extreme for the moment, and you're saying being ahead of his time, an early feminist, an early believer in social welfare, an early believer in healthcare systems, and age-old pensions for the elderly, and so on. The rap on him was that he was a sot, that he was drunk. How true is that?
I don't know. It's really hard to say, because our ideas about alcohol consumption would not fit with the 18th century. Water was often unsafe. And so cider and ale and wine and Madeira were considered more healthful beverages to consume than water. You could have tea if you boiled the water. But I mean, I think Adams wrote in one of his letters that he would start his day with breakfast and with a cider. That was how he started his day. So they were like perpetually kind of drunk. And so I just think that it's hard to sometimes tell, where does that line of overconsumption cross? And if you look at the list of toasts they did at feasts, toasts are accompanied with alcohol. And so you gotta just imagine the amount that was consumed. I think later in his life, he did probably overconsume because he was sad and he was depressed and he was alone and he was broke and sort of living with people he didn't want to be living with. And so I do think he probably then drowned his sorrows a bit. But I haven't seen a whole lot of evidence that sort of the peak of his life, he was a drunk.
He had a big rubicund nose, and people thought that he was, always in the blush of alcohol. Of course, it's an easy way to discredit somebody. Doesn't he wind up on a little farm at New Rochelle?
He receives a farm from New Rochelle during the war as a sort of a gift and a pension to thank him for his service. He later, however, ends up living with like this elderly widow because he's so ill and he can't take care of himself, and New Rochelle wants nothing to do with him as a town. And so he's living as sort of a boarder with her and has really poor declining health over a series of many years. He did not go in a quick and easy way, and really, I think, suffered towards the end of his life.
I wanted to bring us back to something that was talked about in the beginning of this conversation, and I don't think any wise politician underestimates the importance of public opinion, particularly in American politics. And if you think of the time of Paine, according to what I have read and heard, there was only about 55% of the American population that were firmly in favor of revolution. So then we have Thomas Paine, who single-handedly produces the greatest selling pamphlet or book in that period of American history and influences thousands of people's thought about the revolution. I think about that and how important his role was. Now, granted, he ended up living a tragic life. It gets even worse if you start reading about how bad things got for him. I don't think it was because he was vindictive. I think it was because he believed the things he wrote. Comments on that?
First of all, 55% may be too high. We don't know how many people were in favor of the revolution, but the sense you get from the reading, and we don't have any accurate way of really knowing, but the sense you get is that the revolution was the work of a strong-minded minority in the United States. I think Paine had a kind of genius. I think we can call him a genius to understand the zeitgeist, understand what was happening. He just didn't have an editor. He needed an editor. He needed someone to say, yeah, maybe not that. Maybe this isn't the right year for the book, The Age of Reason, or maybe tone down this sentence or that sentence. I don't know what his influence was, and I want to ask Lindsay that. I don't think we began with this. I don't think we can measure his influence. We want to say he had a galvanizing effect on the American public, because how could he not, with 500,000 copies sold and many of them having multiple readings and including public readings. But I don't think we have any real way of knowing, do we, Lindsay?
No, it is really hard to measure. And he had, the success of Common Sense sort of obscures the success and the importance of American Crisis, which came earlier, which was actually quite essential to galvanizing support early on in the war and up through 1776, and encouraging citizens to support the troops, to serve in the army in ways, the famous line, these are the times that try men's souls, doesn't come from Common Sense. It comes from American Crisis. And so he had a long and very important career. An interesting hypothetical, sometimes his tendency to put his foot in his mouth because he publishes something he shouldn't reminds me a little bit of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton publishes some stuff that he really should not, and it harms his career and it harms his reputation. But maybe he had the sort of unfortunate fortune to die before he could really alienate all of the people that he might have had he lived longer. Yeah. And I wonder if, because
he didn't finish off his reputation. He didn't live long enough to do it.
Exactly. And so I wonder if Paine had died earlier, if we would remember him in a different way, or if Hamilton had lived longer, if we would remember him more like we remember Paine. Just an interesting counterfactual. No way to know, of course. But I do wonder if, that sort of similarity says something in that I don't think that Hamilton either. I mean, sometimes Hamilton was trying to destroy people's careers like Adams. But I don't think that either of them were necessarily cruel. They just didn't know when to stop talking sometimes.
But Jefferson did. And Jefferson had one advantage that neither of them had. He had Madison. And Jefferson sends all of his wildest stuff to Madison and says, "What do you think, Jimmy?" And Madison takes about a week and writes back an extremely careful letter bringing Jefferson down off the ledge. And several times Madison saved Jefferson from major gaffes. And the ones that wound up being controversial, aside from Notes on Virginia, were letters that were leaked. And of course, the Matsai letter among them. But Jefferson's biggest mistake, and he knew it, was allowing Notes on Virginia to be published. He should have known that there was no way to keep it private, but he wanted a private printing. And the sentence that got him was not about slavery. It was about Christianity. Whether you believe that God is 1 or 20, neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. No single sentence in Jefferson's life was used against him as often and as effectively as that, because it suggested that at the very best he was some sort of a irreverent free thinker, and maybe worse. So that, I think, but I want to just quote two sentences. You quoted one here, and it's from the Crisis Papers. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country. I mean, that's entered the language. You hear this all the time. These are times that try men's souls. And the other one is my favorite sentence from the entire American Enlightenment. It comes from Common Sense. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. Wow.
It's a great line.
Wrong, but man, what a line, huh?
It's a great line, and it's a great sentiment, and I like to believe that it's true. I like to believe that we can wake up tomorrow and choose to do better, and choose to be better, and choose to cause change for the positive good. And that sort of inspiration is, I think, what made him so compelling and so powerful, and also maybe hard to measure that. It is hard to measure how someone affects thought and idea. That's really hard to quantify.
I heard a little melancholia there, Lindsay. I want to just probe you on this for a moment. You like to wake up in the morning thinking we might be Paine's people. that we have it in our power to renew the American experiment? You're a historian, you've read extensively, you've had a brilliant education, now you're a writer, you're frequently in media, you're writing podcasts and blogs and so on. Tell us actually how you feel. Do you think we can recover, or do you think that we're really in the trough here and it'll be a narrow thing if we can come out of this?
I wake up hopeful, and then I often read the news. And the thing that's great about history is it is both encouraging in that we know that the nation has been in dire moments before of intense partisan division and threats to our democratic institutions and pulling apart at the seams, threat of warfare, et cetera, et cetera. So knowing that we have gone through that and come out the other side is in some ways incredibly comforting. However, the parallels, if we say, okay, well, when was that? That's really not great to say, this really feels an awful lot like the 1850s. And the thing that required us to get through it was a civil war.
680,000 people dead.
Yeah, so that's really not ideal. And hopefully not the outcome that's required. I do think we are in a crisis moment. There's no doubt we're in a crisis moment. Most democracies generally fail. They fail slowly until they all of a sudden have a very dramatic end. And I feel a little bit like we're the frog in the pot that's boiling, and we have just noticed that, oh my gosh, the water is about to boil and we need to get out. I wish that I had a more positive way to wrap this description up. I'm trying. I like to believe. I know that there are people out there that are doing great things to try and, save democratic institutions and all of that. But I guess at this moment, I'm feeling a little dark. Sorry.
Well, we're out of time, and I have an advantage that our listeners don't. I can actually see you, and over your shoulder is a bookshelf. Includes a copy of The Cabinet, includes Barack Obama's memoir. But above you, right above your head, is H.W. Brand's Theodore Roosevelt, The Last Romantic. Maybe, I hope you're not a Rooseveltian thinking that a man on horseback is going to come and save us.
No, instead I like to think of Roosevelt's, on my other wall, I have a copy of his The Man in the Arena speech. I don't know if it's going to work, but I'm in the arena and I'm trying. And I hope, that's the best we can do is be there and show up. And maybe we'll go down in a blaze of glory, and who knows, but I at least will have been in the arena.
Our favorite woman in the arena, Lindsay Chervinsky, here again talking about Thomas Paine. As we go out, name a book we should read about Thomas Paine.
I would recommend Harvey Kaye's The Thomas Paine and the Promise of America.
There you go. Harvey Kaye, Thomas Paine, and the Promise of America. Thank you, Lindsay. Come back as often as you please. We'll see everybody next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.